All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We're going to unpack the actual, literal, biological machinery behind how our brains process isolation. Look, we all know human beings, and honestly most mammals, are inherently social creatures, right? Having a tight social network doesn't just make us feel good, it gives us a massive survival advantage. But what actually happens up there when that network just completely disappears? Today, we're going to trace the exact neural circuitry that essentially forces us to seek out connection when we find ourselves totally alone.
You know, for the longest time, we've kind of boxed loneliness in as purely a psychological thing, a feeling. But what if I told you it's actually a highly structured, multifaceted survival state? When you're isolated, your brain undergoes physical, measurable changes to adapt to that challenge. And this brings up a really exciting question. How exactly does the brain orchestrate all of this at once? Like, how does it simultaneously make us feel absolutely miserable about being alone, incredibly vigilant of our surroundings, and super motivated to go find a friend?
Okay, to really get this, we first got to talk about social homeostasis. Think of loneliness literally like a biological thermostat in your house. When you haven't eaten, your blood sugar drops and your hunger thermostat kicks in, making you raid the fridge. Well, when your social connection drops too low, this homeostatic drive kicks in to correct the deficit. It is a fundamental, hardwired need state operating on the exact same basic biological principles as hunger, thirst, or even needing to sleep. So, to track down exactly where loneliness lives, we're going to follow the neural pathways through 5 key steps: the anatomy, the control center, 3 paths of isolation, the chemical language, and finally, the survival drive. Starting right off with Section 1, the anatomy of loneliness. When researchers actually study the brains of socially isolated subjects, they find some honestly wild adaptations. First off, being alone physically strengthens the synapses in very specific midbrain neurons. Because you are essentially starved for connection, your brain aggressively ramps up its responsiveness to social stimuli. If you've been alone for a week, suddenly just the idea of talking to someone is intensely salient. And this is absolutely crucial. It's a paradox. Being alone feels terrible, which creates an aversive state. And that negative feeling is exactly the reinforcement that motivates us to seek out others for relief. It's just a brilliant biological push and pull. Which brings us to Section 2, meet the control center. Say hello to the DRN-DAT neurons. These little guys are dopamine-producing neurons tucked deep inside a brain region called the dorsal Raphe nucleus. You can basically think of these specific neurons as the ultimate control center for loneliness. Using some incredibly advanced techniques to trace where these neurons send their signals, researchers figured out that this tiny cluster acts like a central dispatcher. It sends out completely distinct survival orders to the rest of the brain to manage our entire response to being alone. Now, the absolute most crucial concept here is something called collateralization. Simply put, it means that just literally one single individual neuron can branch out its physical connections to control multiple, totally distinct behavioral departments across your brain, all at the exact same time. It's like the ultimate hyper-efficient broadcast system. From a single starting point, the signal just splits and travels to different processing centers simultaneously. Let's look at where those signals go in Section 3, 3 paths of isolation. Check out how this single dispatcher perfectly divides up the work into 3 branches within the extended amygdala. First up, the central amygdala, or CEA. This is your social butterfly. It drives sociability and approach behaviors. Next, you have the BNST, which acts as the vigilant watchman, making you hyper-aware of your environment. And finally, the BLP, or the unhappy camper. This is the branch that actively makes you miserable, basically ensuring you don't just sit comfortably on the couch forever. It literally proves loneliness isn't just one feeling. It's 3 separate actions perfectly coordinated to keep you alive. Zooming in on that first pathway for a second, the social butterfly pathway to the CEA, we see something super interesting. When researchers use optogenetics, which is literally shining a light into the brain to activate the specific pathway, it acts exactly like a volume dial for sociability. The subjects instantly start seeking out social interaction. But get this, the dial is actually influenced by the individual's existing social rank. Dominant individuals show a much higher social preference when stimulated. And to prove just how essential this pathway is, if researchers block this exact connection, subjects completely lose that natural, eager rebound to socialize after they've been isolated. The drive just vanishes. So when you put it all together, these separate pathways perfectly recreate the exact behavioral profile of a lonely individual. The CEA is actively pushing you to seek out friends. The BNST has you pacing nervously, checking your environment for any potential threats, and the BLP is making you feel generally miserable so you won't stay put in your isolation. It is just an absolute masterclass in evolutionary engineering.
Moving right along to section 4, a complex chemical language. So, how is the brain actually sending these messages? Well, it turns out it's not just a simple electrical pulse. Researchers discovered these neurons use a complex multi-transmitter language. They can release fast-acting transmitters like glutamate and dopamine, which act like quick shouts to cause immediate excitation or inhibition. But at the exact same time, they release slow-acting neuropeptides like VIP and NPW. These act more like whispers, providing long-term, persistent emotional states. Basically, your loneliness circuit can shout an immediate reaction while simultaneously whispering a long-lasting mood that sticks around for hours.
Let's look at this at a cellular level, specifically in the BLP. Remember, that's our unhappy camper region. When the signal arrives there, it isn't just chaos. A massive 93% of the target pyramidal cells are actively inhibited. The exact same dopamine input causes an overwhelming inhibition in these cells, effectively silencing them to create that overwhelming feeling of place avoidance and aversion. Meanwhile, flip over to the CA, our social butterfly spot, and the exact same chemical input basically splits the room right down the middle. It specifically excites one type of cell, late-firing neurons, while inhibiting regular-firing ones. What this tells us is that the brain isn't just flipping an on-off switch for behavior. No, it is fundamentally altering the overall dynamic patterns of the neural network to precisely tune our social motivation. And that leads us perfectly into section 5, the loneliness survival drive. Let's actually map out the exact sequence of this survival drive from start to finish. Step 1, you experience social isolation. Step 2, that control center we talked about, the DRN-DAT neurons, kicks into high gear and increases dopamine tone in the central amygdala. Step 3, by recording live calcium dynamics, researchers actually saw that stimulating this circuit rewires how the amygdala represents social information in real time. It shifts the neural ensembles so that social stimuli become incredibly attractive. And finally, step 4, driven by this entirely altered brain state, you physically get up and seek out connection. I think this quote from the researchers really nails it. Basically, they're saying loneliness isn't some sort of flaw or weakness. It's a beautiful, incredibly flexible, and deeply coordinated survival reflex. It's orchestrated by this brilliant midbrain dispatcher that is explicitly designed to push you back toward the safety and warmth of the pack. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to chew on. Based on your own habits, what is setting your internal social thermostat right now? The next time you feel that little pang of loneliness, remember, it's not a bug in your system. It's actually just your brain working perfectly to keep you connected and alive. Thanks for joining me today, and keep exploring the fascinating neuroscience of your everyday life.